Good evening, everyone, and welcome wherever you are joining us from today. My name is Katharina Luther, and I'm the director of the German-American Institute. It is a genuine pleasure to welcome you to tonight's talk, Art Under Fire, Cultural Destruction as a Weapon of War with Hugh Eakin, which is part of our ongoing series, What Unites Us, a series that looks at the values, the challenges, and histories that hold the United States together and that continue to connect us across the Atlantic. As some of you may know, tonight's event was originally planned as an in-person gathering, but the Deutsche Bahn had other ideas. So we have moved online. We are glad you could still join us. And Hugh, I hope you made it from Halle an der Saale back to Berlin. 80 years after the end of World War II, we might have expected the protection of cultural heritage in times of conflict to be settled law and settled practice. And yet, as the images from Syria, Mali, and Ukraine remind us almost daily, it is anything but. Tonight's speaker challenges us to think about why that is and to ask whether we have been framing the problem in an entirely wrong way. Hugh Eakin is editor-at-large of Foreign Affairs, where he shapes coverage of some of the most consequential conflicts of our time, and he is currently a fellow at the American Academy in Berlin. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New Yorker, among many others. And now he's online here with us. Welcome, Hugh. Good to have you.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Our conversation will be guided by Professor Dr. Megan Luke of the Institute of Art History at the University of Tübingen, and I'm very grateful to her for joining us as a moderator this evening. Welcome, Megan. Good to have you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Perfect. With that, the floor is yours. Take it away.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and welcome again to this, what promises to be a fascinating discussion about world heritage and thinking about the ways in which the loss of world heritage, I imagine, is felt around the globe, even if the effects of the violence of war and conflict are felt asymmetrically around the world. So I think that culture is a perfect lens through which to engage this question of what unites us, particularly in times of ever increasing a sort of splitting of information and access to information in this sort of period of extremes and upheaval that we're in. So I'm very delighted, Hugh, that we have this opportunity to hear your thoughts about your most recent research and project. And I'm not going to take up more time. I want to turn the floor directly over to you. And then after your remarks, I will pose some initial questions, and then I'm sure we'll have many comments from our online audience, which I'm happy to moderate as the evening goes on. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to the Deutsch-Amerikanisches Institute for hosting this event. I also would like to thank my sponsors at the American Academy in Berlin, who helped connect me with the Institute. I would have been thrilled to talk to all of you in Tübingen, and I hope I will have some opportunity in the future to make it to what I have heard is a truly lovely city, especially at this time of year. I'm going to share my screen now, and I hope all of you will be able to see my slides here, and I look forward to your comments. This is very much an ongoing project. I'm asking a lot of questions as much as providing answers, so I look forward to a really vigorous conversation. With that, let's get started. So I wanted to begin with what may seem like a familiar story. This is the November pogrom of 1938, what we call, what is often called Kristallnacht, the Night of the Broken Glass. And I probably don't need to rehearse the main events here. This was a systematic attack by Nazi stormtroopers on thousands of Jewish businesses, homes, and synagogues in every town in Germany and Austria. Even police and local authorities were under explicit orders to stand back, let the fires burn. It was one of the 20th century's most terrifying acts of state-sanctioned, intentional cultural destruction. And for the Nazis in Berlin, one of the most coveted targets was, of course, the Neue Synagoge in the center of Berlin. It's hard to think of a more conspicuous symbol of Jewish attainment in Germany. This was the largest synagogue in Germany. It could hold up to more than 3,000 people. It was the architecture itself was extraordinary and renowned all over Europe when the synagogue was inaugurated in the 19th century, 1866. It was in the Illustrated London News, as you see here on the right, based on the Alhambra, one of the most mythologized palaces in all of Europe. So this was a huge symbol. And when the violence began, of course, the SA men rushed to attack this great building and set it on fire. But then something else happened, which may be less familiar to you. So the local police chief of the precinct where the synagogue was, he refused to carry out those orders of standing back and letting it burn. What did he do? He chased the SA men away, and he called the fire department, and he ordered them to put out the fire. So in the end, Germany's arguably most important synagogue, right in the heart of the Nazi capital, was one of the very few Jewish cultural sites to survive that terrible night. Now, it might be tempting to regard this story as this remarkable story as a kind of exception that proves the rule. After all, we do know what happened after Kristallnacht, what happened in the years that followed, and the destruction was truly vast. But I would like to argue tonight that this story of this one police chief is less anomalous than we might think. Before I get to that, though, I think it's important to establish just what we mean when we talk about cultural destruction, which has taken many forms throughout the modern era. Cultural destruction in warfare, in conflict, cultural violence. What is it? What do we mean by this? So I'm just going to walk through a few different varieties of what I would describe as cultural destruction. And up until the end of the 19th century, really into the early years of the 20th century, colonialism was a major force of cultural destruction. And what I mean by that is, Western military force often being used to plunder or eradicate or destroy indigenous cultures. And a notorious case, of course, is the British raid on the Kingdom of Benin, a punitive raid and kind of sacking of the royal palace, which is how we ended up with the Benin bronzes, which I'm sure many of you have followed, that ended up in not just in London, but in many European collections. That was a kind of dominant form of cultural destruction. But in the 20th century, that is really taken over by mechanized warfare. And the really major episodes of cultural destruction in the 20th century, many of them are driven by just the sheer power of modern military force and this doctrine, which in the lingo is called military necessity. And this was this dilemma that major powers on all sides really were caught up in the major wars of the 20th century. So what do you do when a major cultural site is close to or might itself be a military objective or be understood to be a military objective? This is what happened in many cases in the First World War and even more so in the Second World War. And here the kind of emblematic case is Monte Cassino Abbey, this great Benedictine monastery south of Rome that, after months of efforts, the Allied forces moving up the Italian peninsula had decided basically we have to destroy this abbey because the Germans are are using it, or they thought they were. It turns out that story was wrong. This was a terrible tragedy. In fact, the Germans were not using the abbey as a defense, and destroying it didn't really help the Allied advance. But so it was. By the 21st century, our current century, the real focus of cultural destruction becomes what I'm going to call extremism. We all know about the Bamiyan Buddhas destroyed by the Taliban in 2001. Well, there were other cases, ISIS in Syria and Timbuktu, these gorgeous, extraordinary mud brick mosques, more than 1,000 years old, were destroyed, often with very low-tech tools, hammers so this became kind of the way that we thought of cultural destruction in recent years. And I would like to argue also that that's kind of how the international Western powers and international bodies like the UN began to think of it too. Like the great militaries of the world have kind of adopted better practices since World War II. We're getting better at dealing with the military necessity question. It's really a problem of extremism. And for the first time, you have this kind of consensus coming together in the 2010s. Here is this first ever UN Security Council resolution in 2017. All 5 powers on the UN Security Council, quote, condemns the unlawful destruction of cultural heritage, including the destruction of religious sites and artifacts, notably by terrorist groups. So they all agree. If we can just deal with those extremists, we're really kind of making progress on this terrible issue that has been a kind of plague of the modern era. Well, 10 years later, we're in a very different situation. And I'm just going to give you a few quick examples. This is Yemen. An entire archaeological museum was wiped out by the Saudi Air Force in 2015. In Tigray, Ethiopian and Eritrean forces shelled this mosque, which is actually the oldest mosque in the African continent, from the 7th century, a very, very early structure. Odessa, Ukraine, in July 2023, was hit. This cathedral, this great Orthodox cathedral in the UNESCO protected historic center of Odessa was hit by a Russian missile, and this is what the interior looked like after that hit. Now, Gaza, I'm not going to show you images of the rubble, which you have undoubtedly seen, but I think something that's important to remember is it's not just the destruction of buildings and the really terrible human toll, but actually there's a whole cultural fabric that was extremely vibrant in Gaza before the war started, and it included archives, libraries, universities, but also museums and also contemporary art. And this painting was one of many in the Shabik Contemporary Art Center in Gaza City. The museum was wiped out and all of its paintings destroyed. And I bring this up not to make some kind of equivalence between art and people, but rather just to say that this is important too. And when we talk about rebuilding Gaza, a lot of this stuff is irreplaceable. You can't recreate a painting that has been reduced to ashes. So that was Gaza, and then even more recently, we have what has taken place, literally almost as we speak. This conflict in Iran, led by the United States, and in Isfahan, one of the great historic repositories of world culture, with many, many monuments, and many of them actually UNESCO World Heritage Sites. Here is one of them, a palace that was severely damaged in a aerial strike. So that gives us a kind of a fairly dark view of cultural destruction, and it's happening really by powerful advanced militaries. These are no longer extremist marginal groups. If you look at the major episodes. And I want to bring up one other element to this, which I'm going to call cultural repression. And I think this is another area of cultural destruction that we don't pay enough attention to. And that is what happens, outside of actual war or conflict when a government increasingly uses culture to either to forward its ideology or to centralize power, to take away democracy. And this is something you may be familiar with if you think about, what's happened to the, Uyghur heritage in China, but it's happening right in the center of Europe. And a great example of this is Slovakia. I don't know how many of you have followed what's been happening there recently under the Robert Fico government, but there's a right-wing minister of culture who has literally sacked all of the top cultural officials in the country. Not the national theater director, the director of the National Museum, the director of the National Library, complete kind of purge of the cultural, the people that directed cultural institutions in the country, and this kind of ideologization of cultural policy and emphasizing traditional values and so this is just an artwork that was done by this illustrator in Bratislava, which I thought very well captured this kind of both Orwellian but also terrifying destructive monster, which has become the kind of the cultural ministry in this kind of illiberal moving country. And I'm singling out this because it's a very current example, but I think that those of you who follow events on both sides of the Atlantic will also see many of these things happening in the United States. And there are a number of other countries. One could cite Hungary recently, Poland, that have in various ways applied this kind of pressure. So that's another thing I want to think about when we talk about cultural destruction. Now, having kind of laid this out, you may think, okay, we have a kind of hopeless sense of all this destruction happening now, maybe even more than in the recent past. Does this mean that laws are completely irrelevant? And I think that it's important actually to have a strong understanding of just how have we thought about cultural destruction over the past, through this era that I traced, going back to the 19th century, still in the era of colonialism. Did anybody think about this? What did they think? How did this relate to laws? We have a general sense that the legal architecture that emerges is really part of the kind of post-war liberal order. So in the middle of this list, you see the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. This is still the kind of reigning major treaty. It has overwhelming support. Something like 134 countries have supported it. And this is part of this kind of post-war idea of we're going to get past the terrible things that happened in the world wars. But as you see from this list, actually there were earlier things already happening that we've been thinking about this issue for a very long time, and not just international laws, but here in Germany, as early as 1914, so the first year of the First World War, the Kunstschutz was established. It was this, the idea that the military, within the military, there should be a protective force that is trying to do something to protect sites caught in the crossfire. Of course, you can argue how effective that actually was in practice, but my point is that there's a lot of ideas here, and they're continuing to evolve even today. But what I'm particularly interested in is looking at some of the early ideas going back to the 19th century that we may have actually, there have been some innovations that we still haven't sort of fully appreciated today. One of the really interesting ones is the Lieber Code. And this happens to be the very first modern piece of sort of law governing the protection of culture. It's not international law. This was made for the Union Army in the middle of the American Civil War. But what's so interesting about this, so Lincoln the Union Army needs a new updated code of conduct. And the guy that writes this Columbia law professor named Francis Lieber, he includes very explicit language about art, so protection of art. And he says, classical works of art, as he phrases it, must be secured against all avoidable injury, even when they are contained in fortified places whilst besieged or bombarded. Now, this is interesting for a number of reasons. One of which is, in the 1860s in the United States, there really aren't even any art museums yet. I mean, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the great museum in New York, is still a decade away from being founded. There aren't major art collections as there would be in Europe. So it's kind of odd that, this happens in the United States. There's this first example of thinking about art in warfare. Well, actually, there's a German connection here. So Francis Lieber was Franz Lieber. He was born in Berlin in the Napoleonic era. And as a young man, literally as I think like a 15 or 16-year-old, he fights in the Battle of Waterloo. He goes on to become a kind of a Prussian liberal who's fighting for sort of liberalism across Europe. He volunteers in the Greek War of Independence before eventually emigrating to the United States and becoming this kind of eminent lawyer, advising President Lincoln. So I think, and I'm speculating here because I this is still an open question for me, but my guess is that he brought this experience from the Napoleonic Wars, where art was hugely important. There was a lot of plunder. And in the Greek War of Independence, the Greek monuments were in the crossfire, the Acropolis. He had in his background a very clear sense both of actual fighting in war and the threat to culture. So this is a really interesting idea that we've sort of forgotten. And I would say his idea that they should be protected even in places that are being besieged or bombarded, we still haven't kind of fully gotten there because the 1954 Hague Treaty still allows a kind of loophole for, if you have to target something, you still can. So another really interesting, forgotten early idea was aerial warfare. And this is really kind of astonishing to me when I learned about this, because this is 1923. We're talking about airships in this era. This is the sort of dawn of military aviation. And yet this international group of jurists, actually led by an American international law expert, met in The Hague to come up with some new rules. Like, this is going to be a big issue, basically, they saw. And the kind of key insight for them was that unlike land warfare, aerial warfare could suddenly reach deep into civilian areas. They were far away from the front lines. And those civilian areas had a lot of cultural sites as well. And so in addition to coming up with specific rules about protecting civilians, these rules that they drew up had a very clear plan for protecting cultural sites. And one of the things I found really innovative was, well, how do you, in practice, how are you really going to do that? Their idea was, we'll have designated sites would be put on a list in peacetime. So this is a cultural site, you can't target it. And to get around the problem of enemy, a defender might actually militarize that site, knowing that it would never be attacked. I mean, this is the kind of what Israel had alleged often about Hamas using civilian sites, and then they would target them. So these rules actually first saw that problem, and they said, well, we should just have international inspectors, like weapons inspectors. These would be cultural inspectors. They would go in and make sure that the sites were not being used for military purposes. I just found this a really interesting concept. Of course, this never was formalized into a treaty, and we know sort of the rest of the story. In World War II, aerial bombardment of civilian areas becomes a major part of the war on both sides. And so sadly, we never did formalize that. A third really crucial piece of sort of thinking about cultural destruction comes from this Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, who is a great figure in international law. He's remembered as the father of the Genocide Convention of 1948. But what's interesting about Lemkin is he's thinking about these ideas about, I mean, before genocide is a concept, he's thinking about it early on, and this is before the Nazi era. This is in the late 20s and early 30s. And he's thinking about this because of what happened to the Armenians and what we call today the Armenian genocide. And what's really interesting is not only is he formulating this new idea of collective, a crime against a whole group, but he sees it as having both a humans, attacking humans and attacking their culture. And he actually has two terms for this. So barbarism are attacks against a group of people, and vandalism is an attack against the culture of that group. And there's this quote here: an attack targeting a collectivity can also take the form of systematic and organized destruction of art and cultural heritage. This is a key insight for Lemkin, that actually cultural destruction is serving the purpose of human destruction. It's a weapon of war that is really aimed at the same thing. And this very, to me, very prescient insight, it's astonishing to go back to 1938, just a few years later. So he publishes this idea in 1933. It doesn't really take off, but just 5 years later, we have the November pogrom, which to me is exhibit A of this point that he's figured out, that cultural destruction is another form of human destruction. And we see that in play. Unfortunately, when the Genocide Convention after World War II is written, he's advocating for a cultural peace, but that's never included. So it's kind of an odd, just the politics of making these international laws, that culture never was included in these central kind of architecture of international law dealing with genocide and crimes against humanity. We can talk about there are some modifications of that in more recent times, including the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court, but there still isn't quite a recognition that culture has this central role. So where does that leave us? So we have a lot of really interesting thinking around this issue, but the reality is, the laws that we have are not all that effective. I also, and I don't have time to get into this now, but we maybe in the questions, but there's a case to be made that international intervention of any kind to protect culture is itself a dangerous thing. I mean, this is part of the problem of dealing with the Taliban. They explicitly said, we're destroying these Buddhas because you don't care about it. You don't care about the Afghan people. You just care about these giant statues. So there's a kind of danger of backfiring even, or that this is like a Western elite issue to be thinking about. So what do you do? Well, I want to go back to my opening point about this police precinct chief who protects Berlin's greatest synagogue. And I think that we can begin to talk about other forms of successful cultural rescue, which happens over and over again. If you look at wars, historic wars, and even more recent ones, and I can find many examples of these. And in World War II, another really well-known one is the Nazi official in charge of Florence. He's ordered to blow up all the bridges, and he does not blow up the Ponte Vecchio, which is, of course, the most important, the oldest, and it would be the most tragic loss if that also were destroyed. And here you can see, after the destruction of so much of the city, the bridge survived, and he's kind of remembered as a hero in Florence for that. that's what you could describe as define orders, and there are really interesting examples of that, both historically and more recent. And it does seem to happen. Culture matters to military people in charge. And another sort of permutation of that is when military leaders take account of culture and change their decisions. So this isn't so much define orders as changing orders. And a great example of that is Henry Stimson advised. This is when the Truman administration is planning to drop the atomic bomb on Japan. Kyoto is at the top of the list, and it's the great sort of historic center of Japanese culture. And the recognition of that in the White House, in the end, gets it taken off the list, and Kyoto is preserved. Sadly, of course, the bombs still were dropped, but it's more to point out that yes, culture did play a role in the decision making here of the military in this crucial act of destruction. So that's one thing, define orders. A second kind of form of rescue that I see many, many times is what I would call credible authority. And this is a really interesting example of this, and maybe almost hard to kind of, today at the center of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the most tense site is right at the center of Jerusalem, of course. This is the site that to Muslims is the Haram al-Sharif, one of the holiest sites in Islam, and to Jews it is the site of the former temple. So it's the Temple Mount, and so you have these two at the center of this conflict. You have an actual site that both religions are claiming, and at this very tense moment, in June 1967, Israel has just defeated a group of Arab powers. It's this great triumphal moment for Israel and reclaiming the old city of Jerusalem. And Israeli paratroopers enter the Haram al-Sharif. And in this moment of kind of euphoria, that for many Israeli Jews, this is, in 2,000 years, they are finally reclaiming this site. There's a real risk of damage or destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock. These are some of the most important sites in Islam. The Israeli flag goes up over the Dome of the Rock, and there's even the pressure within the sort of right wing is this is our moment. Let's just destroy it. And there is extraordinary restraint on the part of some military leaders like Moshe Dayan and the political establishment to kind of prevent this from happening. But there's just an overwhelming pressure on the part of ordinary people who wanted to pray there again. Jews wanted to be able to go up to what they thought of as the Temple Mount and pray. And so the answer was this group of the most, really all the mainstream rabbis in Israel issued a religious injunction, kind of using exquisite Talmudic logic, that because the actual site of the temple was not known, it was forbidden to pray there. And this was religious authority that was overwhelmingly respected. And with this authority, the status quo held, and more or less has held up to the present. There's a huge amount of tension over this site, but just as proof now, this is, after the first, the 40-day war. This is as recently as a few weeks ago. Muslims are again worshippers arriving for Friday prayer before dawn. It is still a site and that has been held intact, and this sharing, the Waqf, the Islamic authorities are the custodians of the site, and Jews are allowed to pray at the Western Wall, and this is more or less held. I'm pessimistic as to whether this can continue, but it is an extraordinary example of credible authority. And then just finally, I will just say the other kind of pattern that I've seen in many wars is what I'm just going to loosely call local action, which is when literally people who are themselves persecuted or invaded or attacked will take extraordinary action to save culture that is important to them. We saw this in Timbuktu when these local librarians, literally carried out these Islamic manuscripts that were about to be destroyed by these extremists in 2012. Another more tragic example was Palmyra when ISIS arrived in 2015 and started blowing up temples. Now, the great archaeologist who had for 50 years been in charge of this site was a man named Khalid al-Assad. He's no relation to the Assad family. He grew up literally at the site of Palmyra. It was so much a part of his world that he thought he could not leave when ISIS came. But he did an extraordinary effort to move anything movable away from the site. Many artifacts were rescued before ISIS came. And then he said, I'm going to stay, I'm going to confront them, and I'm going to try to persuade them not to damage the site. But tragically, he was brutally killed by, a man in his 80s was executed by ISIS for this kind of. But I think that his example stands. I'm not arguing that we should be martyring ourselves to rescue culture, but I think it's a very powerful example of why local people will always take action that no international force will ever consider for culture, because culture has a special value to the people who live in and around it. So we have those examples, and I think they all point to a different way of sort of thinking about how we can encourage or enhance those kinds of actions rather than thinking of some kind of international force that's going to come in and which seems implausible. But I think that a larger point we have to consider is that even with these remarkable heroic actions that we see over and over again in many wars, there's a lot of destruction that is happening and continuing to happen. And in some ways, you could say it's accelerating now. So I think another sort of thing we really need to think about in considering the whole sort of panorama of what is cultural destruction, how do we prevent it from happening, and when it does happen, what do we do? What is the approach? And I want to talk about a fourth kind of rescue, which I will call sort of, I guess you could say it's cultural rescue. It's when culture itself takes destruction and does something with it. And we all know Picasso's Guernica as this, it's often considered the sort of universal statement, anti-war painting of the 20th century. But before it was universal, it was specific, and it was highly specific about a specific atrocity that took place in the Basque town of Guernica in 1937. And this was the first aerial destruction of an entire city in Europe. It was by the Condor Legion, this part of the German Air Force that was helping Franco, and literally experimenting on how to do maximum destruction of a city. And so Picasso's great work is it's a cultural record of this new kind of atrocity. And I think it's extremely powerful in that specific way, beyond its universal qualities that we have been talking about. But it also is specific in another way, which I find really interesting. And this was actually the subject of my previous book. But as you see, this picture comes from 1939, which is 2 years after the attack on the city. And this is when Guernica arrives in the United States in 1939. And in doing so, it is also enacting a kind of cultural rescue, because it is probably the most emblematic work of this movement that happens at precisely the moment when modern art is under its greatest threat in the 20th century, which is the effort to purge quote unquote degenerate art. the attacks on modern artists, the United States awakens to modern art at that moment. And actually, a lot of art itself, as well as artists, escape to the United States and generate this new culture. It's really from 1939 on, that the United States becomes the center of a new kind of modern art culture. So in this act of the destruction that's happening in Europe, there's a genesis of a new reaction to that and culture emerging in the United States. So that's a really important kind of cultural rescue that I see happening. Now, another more complicated case that I want to leave you with is what do you do when the monuments themselves are dangerous? And I think sometimes when we talk about cultural destruction, it's tempting to think that, oh, the correct thing is always preservation. We just want to keep that great stuff of the past. Well, some monuments are really problematic. And I think this has been a debate here in Germany about certain German monuments, and it's certainly a very live debate in the United States. Now, many of you will have followed the terrible white supremacy march that took place in Charlottesville, Virginia. The pretext of this march, which ended so tragically and violently, was this debate that was playing out in the 2010s in the United States, which is the efforts to take down these Confederate monuments, which are all over the landscape and in fact have nothing to do with the actual Confederacy. They were really monuments put up. This one was put up in 1921. General Stonewall Jackson. You'll see Confederate flags in this image. This is really a monument to a kind of, itself is a kind of cultural erasure because it is monumentalizing the kind of removal of African Americans from the story. It's this going back to this kind of imagined past. And so it's a really, really difficult legacy to deal with. On the other hand, do you want to just destroy it and then move on? Because would that be a kind of forgetting if you just destroyed all of these statues? And so a really interesting, remarkable kind of solution to this has happened just in the past year, and this is the great American artist Kara Walker, who does a lot of whose work deals a lot with American history and the African American experience. She's known especially for two-dimensional works. Well, here she was given this sculpture, the Stonewall Jackson Monument, when it was taken down, and she was given the commission of reconstructing it and into something that she thought would be a powerful statement that would, so it was not an act of destruction, but it was an act of kind of reclaiming this terrible monument into something that both remembered the history, but also did something completely different. It's not a heroic man on a saddle. It's a very complicated sculpture. It's hard to see in this image, but the sword is now being sort of dragged across the battlefield. A curator I know who has thought a lot about this work, she said, it's like Stonewall Jackson has switched sides. And I just thought this is a very interesting way of thinking about it. And you may disagree. I mean, there are different views about what should be done about difficult things of the past, but I think it's something we have to also think about when we talk about destruction, preservation, and the future of culture, which is constantly faced with threats and sometimes creates threats of its own. So but before we go to questions, I want to end with going back to my opening example about the synagogue in Berlin, because what happened afterward actually really is important and it's interesting. And I mean, in this case, some of you may know the story, I don't know, but for me, it was really interesting to discover this. So after 1938, the synagogue survives, But then in 1943, it is badly damaged by an Allied bombardment. This is the military necessity, maybe, that I talked about earlier. So after the war, there was actually real confusion about when the destruction had happened. And partly this, I don't have the specific photo, but there was a photograph that was widely circulated in the late 40s of the dome on fire. And it turned out to be a doctored image, unclear the story of it, but the upshot was people thought, well, actually, it really was destroyed in 1938. So there was a kind of forgotten memory of that guy who had stopped the destruction. But what is so important is that it did survive, and it survived enough, even though it was heavily destroyed, that the front section of this, as anyone who visits Berlin today, has been wonderfully restored. And it's not just a recreation of the past, because the entire prayer hall, which was huge, no longer exists. And if you've been to Berlin, you can see it, you can go around behind, and the outlines of where this building stood. It's a very ingenious solution of both remembering what was destroyed, but also keeping this visible symbol of what was so important and what is still important in Berlin today. And it's part of the skyline. And I think that this is a really powerful symbol of what that one person's decision, back in 1938, left us with today, and the role that has been able to play in the kind of repair, the cultural repair that is still happening today. So that brings me to the end of my comments. I really look forward to discussing any of this, or challenge me if you think that you have a different view. But I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you so much, Hugh. And it's one of the sort of uncanny aspects of doing this on Zoom that you don't hear the round of applause that I'm sure would have greeted this fascinating and wide-ranging presentation if we were doing this in person. So allow me to give you my applause on behalf of the group that's joining us here online. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions of my own, but I'm sure we're going to have some varied response from our audience, and I'll just let Katarina sort of signal to me how that's building up on her end. So she's going to feed me questions as they come in. But I want to start by returning to this really provocative question that you raised early on in your presentation about language. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about cultural heritage, or specifically cultural destruction and cultural violence? And I wanted to go back to cultural heritage and think closely about those words. Before I joined the faculty here at Tübingen, I was for many years a professor in the United States, and I was running a sort of collaborative program with the NEH where we were studying similar kinds of questions about cultural heritage, preservation, iconoclasm, destruction, and how that affects the work of, say, historians, art historians, and anthropologists. And we still had a year left of that funding in the sort of first year of the Trump administration and the first year that I was over here in Germany. And because it had the word cultural heritage in its program title, we were stripped of our funding for the last year. And, I think about this whole list of sort of now kind of forbidden words that whether they're being scanned by actual human beings in Doge or AI or whatnot, but cultural heritage, like gender, like slavery, is one of these terms that now, or at the time, I'm not sure what the most recent update of this is, was sort of axed. And so I see that also as a perpetuation of some of this kind of cultural destruction that you were talking about at various points in your project. And likewise, I was very intrigued, especially when you brought up the work of Raphael Lemkin and this barbarism and vandalism discussion, because those are terms that it's almost as if he's inverting or turning the tables on languages about civilization versus barbarism that so often was used to justify these kinds of punitive looting raids, under colonialism. Now that language is being operationalized against, you could say, the civilized who behave in uncivilized ways. That, you know, that the reappropriation of this language to talk about oneself and not just the other, I think, is a very powerful act. So I was wondering if you wanted to just maybe talk a little bit more about how you're also defining words like culture or even heritage in this project, or how you're tracking maybe some shifting uses of those words as you're talking about your different case studies, beyond the question of violence and destruction. Like, what are we talking about when we talk about cultural heritage? That's a huge question, but I'm very curious how it's framing your work.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, the language is so important and so much a part of the evolving story. I mean, even from, terms like Francis Lieber is talking about classical art. I'm not really sure what he means in the 19th century by classical. I don't think he's thinking the way we think of like ancient Greek art, but I think these words do shift over time. And it's actually, you see it in the law now. So the great treaty that I mentioned, the 1954 Hague Treaty, uses the term cultural property, the protection of cultural property in armed conflict. Cultural property has really gone out of fashion. It's really something that we don't use anymore. And that, I mean, for reasons that may be apparent, that, it implies that it's this kind of ownership and there's a sort of broader shift that's happened slowly, but it's now kind of part of international doctrine. When you hear, new laws or rules or ideas, heritage is now the term that is preferred. And I think part of that is also the kind of World Heritage movement. And it's this concept that, culture, it belongs to all of us. And I think I mean, on one hand, that's a beautiful idea. And the idea that there are these sites that are so important that, anyone in the world should want them to exist and survive. But I think it's also a very dangerous idea, and you can see that in sort of some of the actual destruction that's happened. And I think one of the dangers is that it really underprivileges the role that culture plays in local communities and to community identity, and even what constitutes great culture. It may not be a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is the most meaningful sort of site of cultural memory in a particular city or country. And so I think that the language is really difficult, and I don't have a kind of answer. It's more that I think, and being aware of these of the tensions that are kind of built into the language are helpful. Another one I would point out with Raphael Lemkin, who's really fascinating, because he doesn't even have the word genocide yet when he's talking about barbarism and vandalism, even though he's thinking about them as collective crimes. He comes up with genocide during World War II. But what's interesting is that genocide itself as a word does not include war. So it's different than war crimes, which we think of as specifically happening during, what we would think of as a military conflict. And I think the way Lemkin is already thinking about it is he's saying, actually, these things, even maybe a lesser version of them, barbarism and vandalism, can happen in and out of war. And I think that's a really powerful thing too. And it's something that's difficult for international law, because the concept of sovereignty really prevents international intervention in peacetime in a country that may be doing something terrible. There have been efforts to kind of get around that, but it's still a problem. Anyway, great question.
I mean, I was thinking about this term, this double-barreled term of cultural heritage, and how culture is studied. It's a subject of anthropological study, and it tends to sort of transcend, or I guess this idea of historical specificity, that there's this tension between history and culture. Culture is something that endures over time in some ways, and historians studying change over time. And there's a similar kind of tension between the universal and the specific that you brought up with Guernica, right? Like, what is world heritage if not this sort of, as you were saying, a kind of claim for universal validity? And yet, what are we losing when we emphasize the universal value of heritage and sort of obscure, I guess you could say, its historical specificity? And a word like heritage, is heritage the same thing as history necessarily? Or is it a way of kind of keeping present or defying this kind of or resisting the idea of change when it comes to culture? I think it's rhetorically quite powerful. We're starting to collect some questions, but before I turn to the questions that are coming into the chat, I just have one more that I think also helps touch on some of the many threads that are coming together in this presentation. And it's a question that came up in some of your last examples, especially around the sort of dismantling of the Confederate monuments, or you could say monuments to colonialists or sort of violent statesmen or what have you, around the world, certainly in the 2020s. And I mean, I think this is the case where you have the destruction of cultural heritage broadly conceived outside of, say, military conflict, surely, but no less violent. And I was thinking of this question of, is all iconoclasm a form of forgetting, right? Like, if we destroy something, in its destruction, might it not also be more indelible if it had always stood? Oftentimes many of these Confederate monuments or monuments in general tend to be kind of invisible because they become part of or they're invisible to some, but painfully visible to others, but they're kind of in the fabric of everyday life. And it's only when they get torn down that we start to really pay attention to them. And I think that's something that's so powerful about the Kara Walker piece. I was just in Los Angeles. I saw the monument show. And that piece is incredible. And the title, too, when we're talking about rhetorics, of Unmanned Drone, like, it was very interesting to see the title of that piece bring us back to, as you were saying in your earlier section about mechanized warfare. That I wonder if maybe this distinction between the kind of destruction that happens in peacetime and wartime might be getting ever more blurred in this era of the drone, in this era of, like, not just mechanized warfare, but technologized warfare. And this is sort of just a preamble of some of my reactions as a way to set up, I think, is a very interesting question that's come through from the audience, which may be more concrete for you to address, which is, what is the connection between culture and the public? Just, I guess you could say, these collectives that appear in many of your examples. And why has culture become the target of violence over and over? Is there any kind of consistent pattern there? Or, if I can elaborate on the person's question here, are we in a new era of this blurring between peacetime and wartime? Is that what is making the US incursion into Iran or Israel's latest campaign in Gaza so shocking as it kind of should be? Or we feel that some boundary has been crossed in some of the issues you've been raising? So a lot to unpack there, but however you want to take this.
No, a couple of thoughts. So maybe I'll sort of take them in reverse, but yes, I mean, I think that this kind of boundary question is really interesting right now, because we're definitely in an era where you're seeing, I mean, let's just consider the human costs of recent conflicts, extraordinary civilian death and destruction. And this is happening in Ukraine. It happened in Gaza. Even in Iran, in this sort of high-tech, almost robotic war, there were a large number of people were killed. And Lebanon, there are a number of places where this is happening, even that we're not sort of thinking about it maybe as war. And I think that's indicative of itself, that these are kind of simmering things, and I haven't even mentioned Sudan, which is just off the charts. It's on another scale that we don't even talk about this. And yes, you're seeing, terrifying civilian harm on a scale that I think really takes us back to like a different era. Like we sort of think, oh, that, that, somehow this, even the language of military conflict, precision strikes, and we think of, we're not in that era anymore. In fact, I think if you look at culture, it's the same kind of, it's very much of a piece of that. And I think we're back to Lemkin's recognition that they go closely together. So yes, I do think that we are increasingly in this blurred era, and I don't know whether it's war, not war, or just civilians versus and the other sort of key point of that, which comes, goes back to that 1923 idea that I mentioned about, aerial warfare, is that many wars now are targeting cities. They're urban wars, and these urban areas, that's where culture happens. That's where people happen. And so we're seeing this confluence in a way that I think maybe seem more separated. When ISIS is attacking the temple in the desert, it's a different kind of thing. So the second point, I'm sorry, I've now going back to, I think that what was the other sort of.
Well, the idea is like, is all iconoclasm necessarily
Oh, yeah.
a form of forgetting, or could we be saying that through the destruction of certain kinds of culture, and however we want to define that, could it, in its destruction, it might be made more indelible or more heritage, if you will, in its very absence?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. And actually, Kara Walker says this. She was in this long interview she did with the curator of that show, and she kind of just describes it as kind of coming alive in a way that it hadn't been. And I think you really feel that in different kinds of different iterations of what she did, that suddenly we're conscious of this. I mean, who thought about the Bamiyan Buddhas, honestly? I mean, connoisseurs knew about it, but did it, your average person in a Western country really know anything? And now it's an immediate signifier to, you just mention it and people think of this, so there's this odd quality of just, it's a little bit like censorship. When something gets censored, everybody wants to read it or see it. And I think, I mean, it's worse than that, because if somebody's actually destroyed, then it literally is gone. I think that what kind of another interesting way to think about this is what happens when something is sort of ruined but still exists. And like the Gedächtnis Kirche in Berlin, this is an incredible monument that anybody will recognize. And I often think when you pass it, would you notice it if it had just been rebuilt? And that was a decision that many European cities did after World War II. They just rebuilt, there was an overwhelming pressure to do that. But I think today we sort of, there's an understanding that, I mean, it's kind of what I was getting at when ruin value, that actually the way culture understands destruction is important too. And so, what happens afterward really matters.
Yeah, I mean, you could say that also has certain cultural specificity, and we ought not to universalize it. Like I think of for one of my favorite examples to teach with is the Ise shrine in Japan that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, but not as some original artifact that where its material as a building exists through time, but it is consciously dismantled and rebuilt every 20 years so that it remains in perpetuity, always new, always perfect, as part of this sign of religious observance. And I think that's such a different attitude towards what it means to preserve something, right? Or what it means for an artifact to exist through time, disentangling it from the sort of its materialism or its material manifestation, and thinking about maybe the preservation of a whole range of artisanal skill that needs to be preserved so that this traditional way of building can persist through centuries. So it's like, in what does culture consist is a very fascinating question, and I think one that many of your examples raise. We have another question from the audience, which is, to what extent is culture central to one's humanity. And I think you raised this question, when you were giving the caveat of, not to equate sort of cultural artifacts or cultural property, to use that outmoded term, with actual lives and life and death that's being squandered, you could say, in conflict. But nevertheless, to what degree is culture central to one's humanity? And does that recognition also lead to people defying orders, as in the case of Berlin or in Florence? Or is there another force at work, that is sort of negotiating this relationship between, humanity, which again is another abstract term to bring into this conversation, and one that has its own history, and this idea of culture. Hopefully I'm representing this person's questions correctly, but however you want to take that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. It's something that I sort of wrestle with, but which I find fascinating. Why is it that people react? I mean, you see it also in the reaction to destruction, and that there's something very visceral that hits people when they, I mean, with just and conversely, I think there's a kind of awe that we have that is kind of, and I found this interesting. I mean, when you think about, when Constantinople is conquered by the Ottomans, and they don't destroy all the Byzantine churches, they, in their own way assimilate them, or, after, Ferdinand and Isabel, kick the Moors out of Spain, there is a lot of Christianization, and some of it's extremely brutal, but the great monuments, many of them survive, and there's even a kind of assimilation of some of the kind of Moorish styles. So culture has this very powerful force that I think often almost transcends what we think of as kind of enemy and friend, and how even how things play out in war. And I think it's also really interesting to look at individual decisions, like Stimson, and thinking about Kyoto, and that there are, this is, on the one hand, it's terrifying to think that it often comes down to, one or two people making these decisions, but also that people in with the destructive power also, there often is a kind of recognition of culture. I mean, it's odd. I mean, some Hitler actually visited Florence in 1938, and there's a theory that was one reason why he didn't really want Florence to be totally destroyed, even though the destruction of the bridges was planned for. But I think that's a really, I mean, the person raising that question, you're right, you're onto something, because this is a really important issue. Like, what is the essence of this power that it has on us?
Well, and it could also be, I mean, giving the case of, say, why isn't Paris ransacked during the Nazi occupation, for example? There's a similar logic there. Many Jewish cemeteries, for example, survive in East and East Central Europe because it's a sign of kind of preservation, to show this is fully gone. I mean, you can see this also in the way in which you could say the settlers of the United States have oftentimes treated Native American heritage like the people are vanished, even though they're not, but the culture remains, in this kind of strange way in which it might be an expression of a genuine acknowledgement of our humanity in these artifacts, or it may be, in the example of Constantinople, for example, a kind of spolia, right? A kind of power through the reappropriation of a vanquished people in your own material. So it can be an expression of power, and I think that's really important to track. In the case of Khaled Assad in Palmyra, I mean, that's a case where it's so clear. I mean, this is a man who paid for his protection of these artifacts literally with his life. Like, there is a kind of one-to-one equation of heritage with human life, as opposed to maybe other extremes in some of your case studies where this preservation might actually be itself an act of conquest, if not violence, just like iconoclasm might be a form of historical remembrance, or more, or burning a memory of heritage on the mind, as opposed to a form of forgetting. So I think, while there might be kinds of overwhelming majority of ways to read certain things, there's always these counter directions that I think make this such a fascinating topic, and why it feels so live today, especially as you were saying, we're in this moment where who is a civilian? Where do military incursions happen? Where is the front in some of our present day conflicts? Are nowhere near as clear cut. And I would say that I find your focus on the history of the law in this case to be a very productive avenue, and one that certainly me, as somebody who studies cultural artifacts as an art historian, we don't tend to study the law enough in terms of thinking about how actually do these laws that you've outlined for us just on that slide, do they still serve us for the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of technology that cause destruction from a distance, like drones or what have you, or robots even? Are they serving us now? Like, I'm curious, in some of your conversations with maybe administrators, of these kinds of cultural heritage sites or bodies like UNESCO or whatever, are there new proposals for new legislation or new legal language to be addressing some of the most present conflicts? Like, for example, did conflict in Syria, Gaza more recently lead to some sort of call in those communities as well to sort of change some of these definitions? Has that been part of something you've been looking into?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. I wanted to make one other point, which and that related to your earlier question and maybe the listener's question, which was that I think the role we also should talking about propaganda when we're talking about
Yeah.
how culture is saved or reused or repurposed, and propaganda is so important. And you see this historically. I mean, in some ways, we're really no different today. I mean, when the Russians came into Syria after ISIS, and then they sort of said we're helping reclaim Palmyra. They gave this sort of orchestra concert and it was this very ostentatious kind of statement of how Russia was standing for civilization against, of course, seen from the vantage of Ukraine, this is it's pretty transparent what Russia was doing. But I'm saying this happens over and over again. Every power, I think, is conscious of this in some form or another. So aside from that, on the question of are we rethinking this? Yes, and that's, I think, a crucial piece. And one way of looking at it is, we had all this progress in the 2000s and the 2010s. Actually, it's interesting. I mean, part of the story after the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, that's this kind of last, I mean, at the time, this was kind of seen as this last embarrassing failure by a big Western power. Like, you forgot about culture, you just let the Baghdad Museum be sacked, and all these sites. And it really was a galvanizing conflict, in the sense that the US actually signed and ratified the 1954 Hague Treaty in 2009. It had never joined that. It finally does. I mean, a US joining a treaty about protecting culture. Imagine that today. But the other power on the UN Security Council was the UK that hadn't signed it, and UK even later after the US does. So suddenly you have all five powers agreeing to this kind of bedrock treaty from after the war. There's a sense of progress, and it's really about dealing with these crazy terrorists. And I think what's broken down is, yes, you could say, well, there's been erosion of international norms and laws and stuff, but I think there's a real shift in the technology that has really changed the nature of warfare, what we saw in the last 5 years. And yes, there's an active discussion now about, I mean, one of the things was that 82 or 84 nations signed it in 2022, this Declaration on Protecting Civilians. It doesn't have really the force of international law, but it shows that there's a very large number of countries that are thinking about this now. And more recently, I think the real issue that we're confronting now is the artificial intelligence in targeting, which we've already seen in Gaza and Lebanon, and then now Iran, which has just dramatically sped up the amount of ordnance that you can drop on a country by selecting targets that are no longer being vetted by humans. And I think when you look at like this tragic school, girls' elementary school in Iran was on, generated as a target, and this is what happened. But for cultural sites, there's an added problem that I think these algorithms that we're using now no longer, I mean, they are not yet, they are unable to account for the particular issues that cultural sites adjacent to a target may have. So we're really in this new era of warfare, and there is an active discussion right now. It's not driven by culture, but I think there's just a huge amount of concern about the limits of AI in terms of targeting. And I think when you're thinking about targeting, culture is going to, just as civilians are, we're back to this. Yes, civilians and culture will be a central part of thinking about how this new technology plays out.
Yeah, it's it's so interesting. I opened, this sort of discussion with commenting about how Doge's sort of techno optimism about using AI to kind of sort of scan all sorts of pre-existing scientific grant proposals that had been previously funded under the Biden administration by AI, pulls out, suddenly you have things being canceled that are absolutely not sort of culture wars topics, for example, but it's this kind of haphazard nature. And I have no doubt that AI is going to be refined. That is, unless, it all depends on whether we don't have environmental collapse. It's like a neck and neck race of the development of AI and the resources that it uses. But one of the things that I think is coming up for us as we wind down this discussion is also the ways in which the technology of warfare, the technology of destruction is changing, the technology of also propaganda and this kind of blackouts of information. When you talk about Sudan, like, why aren't we talking about Sudan? There may be all sorts of historical and cultural reasons why just the continent of Africa continues to be, I guess you could say, marginalized in terms of how we address certain global geopolitics. But I also think that as we enter into an era of increased automation and so-called generative artificial intelligence, we're going to start to see sort of what we imagine to be a kind of universal or collective right to information, and the representation of culture very much shifting. And there's not a lot of answers for that, but it seems to be another form of violence that this project seems to be a prehistory of. Like, how and when do we represent the destruction or preservation of cultural heritage after the fact, I think is also a question for also the technological frontier. That's more of a statement than a question, but we don't have any other questions from the audience right now. And unless you have some final thoughts, Hugh.
No, but I think that's a really nice way to end. I would just say that actually this kind of leads me to a point that I also wanted to stress, which is that I think that the role that culture plays after a conflict is so important, and it's often sort of underplayed. And there are a lot of, I have kind of been following a sort of separate set of case studies of what are often called sort of post-conflict societies, although I kind of don't like that term, because post-conflict actually usually means there's still conflict in different forms, and often actually kind of culture can become a redimensioning of what had been an actual violent conflict, and now it's taking place in, the victor is destroying, or there's an effort to kind of stamp out an unwanted culture, or there's still a kind of cultural dynamic to what plays out after the war. On the other hand, there are some really fascinating cases, like divided Cyprus is a really interesting one, of where cultural sites have become this point of reconciliation. And even amid, decades of political impasse, the two sides are talking about their shared heritage, they have projects to conserve sites that belong to one or the other communities, or neither. It could be some historic site, but in the north and in the so on both sides of the Cyprus that's happening. And I think that's the kind of thing that you see in more places than you would think, and that this is again stressing that culture it's both an early warning of conflict. I mean, the way that in Lemkin saw that, vandalism is, it's barbarism to come, but it can also be an early way of repair. It's like the first thing that can be done, even when really hard political questions can't be resolved. And once you created this or recreated a kind of commonality, an understanding of shared culture, at least a recognition, that opens up really important possibilities. And I just think maybe that's a good place to end, if we can think of something.
I was just going to say, what a beautiful and also reparative conclusion to this fascinating and wide-ranging discussion, but also research project. I'm sure our audience is really eager to see where this takes you and the publications that result from this for you. So thank you so much, Hugh, for your generosity with us this evening, despite all the hullabaloo with the travel. I'm glad that we have this virtual forum to have had this conversation regardless. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks to our audience for listening and sending in some great questions. I hope you enjoyed it.
Perfect. Well, then I'm going to say my thank yous as well. I took so many notes, and I'm also super glad that we are preserving this conversation for our diverse audiences on YouTube, of all places, but here we have it. Thank you so much, Hugh, for your presentation and for sharing your research so generously. And thank you, Megan, for guiding such a rich and thought-provoking conversation. And before we close, I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to the partners who made this evening possible, the American Academy in Berlin. Hugh, please say our hellos and our thank yous. Please pass them on. I also want to say thanks to the Landeszentrale für politische Bildung Baden-Württemberg, Kupferblau, das Campus Magazin, and the Institute of Political Science at the University of Tübingen. We here at the German American Institute are so grateful for your support and your collaboration. Thank you all for joining us tonight. We hope to see you at the next event in our What Unites Us series on June 11th on women, minorities, and the 14th Amendment. And in the meantime, spread the word, take care, and good night. Bye.
Bye.